Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today, giving up your lunch break to listen to what I hope is going to be a really fascinating discussion. I'd like to remind you before we start that this event will be on the record and it will also be live streamed. And we encourage you to engage with the discussion online as well. If you could use the hashtag #CHEvents, that would help us enormously. Please check that your phones are on silent. And we'll begin in a few seconds. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Tim Benton today. Tim's my boss. He's Research Director of Energy, Environment and Resources here at Chatham House. He's also Dean of Strategic Research Initiatives at the University of Leeds. He wears many, many different hats. One of which is a lead author on the special report published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change this summer, looking at climate, land and food. And that's what he's here to talk to us about today. So I'll pass straight over to Tim, if I may.
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see so many faces. So this is a really big ask to try and fit in something that is both a primer and gives you some of the meat to, if you'll excuse the pun, about climate change, land and food. But I just want to start off by making 3 points on this. These are images from today's newspapers. So Venice floods, Yorkshire floods, Australia, California fires. And they are all related in some way to climate change, made more likely by climate change. On the left-hand graph, what you see is the long-running temperature carbon dioxide record from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. The red line is carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And I hope you can see, without any hint of statistical or psychological bending, that line is not going down. It's not even going up, it is increasing. And actually the likelihood is that this year is going to be a record year for greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then just as an aside, because I won't have a chance to talk about it, this line here is a record of pH in the sea from Hawaii as well. And as you can see, one of the real issues of climate change and carbon dioxide is acidification and warming of the oceans. And as the oceans warm, and that's quite a significant change from a biological perspective, we are going to, almost certainly over the next 30 years, we will lose coral reefs around much of the world. And just pause for a second there. Sorry, Laura, you're going to have to keep me on track. I grew up in an era where we were just discovering the power of television, and one of my favorite television programs when I was a young boy was a program about a big boat that sailed around the Great Barrier Reef. And then following that, we had Jacques Cousteau and David Attenborough, and the power of those images of coral reefs was huge and certainly has shaped my life and my thinking about the world. When they're gone, they'll be gone. And with them, we will lose marine fisheries because many fish have nursery grounds in coral reefs. And we'll, of course, lose livelihoods from fisher folk around the world in the tropics. And, of course, barrier reefs also act as a very important flood defense. And as sea level is rising by about 3 centimeters per decade, as sea level is rising, barrier reefs play an important role in sea defenses. So, in many ways, it's a nasty thing to be happening. So anyway, let's just start off in the beginning. Climate change is not rocket science. Climate change is bloody obvious. We've known about it for decades. Anybody who's a gardener knows that if you go into a greenhouse, it's warmer in a greenhouse than outside, which is why we have greenhouses. And the greenhouse effect is a layer of glass acts as a filter. So you get shorter wave radiation coming in, heating the ground. Longer wave radiation radiates from the ground, but gets trapped by that layer of glass. And in the atmosphere, that layer of glass is actually taken by a whole range of molecules with particular properties, carbon dioxide, methane, and so on. So it's not rocket science. This is a figure from a paper that was written 80 years ago now, 81 years ago now, which is effectively doing one of the first analyses that predicts climate change. And so I'll show you a figure in a minute, but bear in mind that it's about 0.4 degrees is predicted from this from 1890 to pre-war periods, and actually that's what it was. So, greenhouse gases, as I said, are rising. This top figure comes recently, September 25th. I downloaded it from Mauna Loa. The bottom one is the last 800,000 years. So this is all of this stuff is from the ice cores, so taking ice and then analysing the bubbles of atmosphere that are trapped in the ice. And as you can see, we're up here now. Completely unprecedented rise, nothing like it in the historical record, of course. And it's not just carbon dioxide, which is this. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and methane largely comes from decomposition processes, so wet soils. Rice farming is a big cause of methane. Comes from bacteria in the rumen of cows, so livestock is a big source of methane, and so on. Melting permafrost would be another one. And nitrous oxide is the other one, and nitrous oxide typically comes from manufacturing and burning processes, but it also comes from the use of nitrogen fertilizers with respect to agriculture. So actually, agriculture, you can already see is playing a part because we chop down rainforest to make agricultural land and free up the carbon. We have lots of cows that produce lots of methane, and we grow lots of rice, which produce lots of methane, and we use a lot of fertilizer for driving the yields. So climate change, what does it mean? So one of the things that I think that we haven't done well as a climate community is really explained what climate change means from a risk perspective. So these are two ways of showing the data. This is the average temperature on a global basis over time going back to 1860 with the 20 coldest years and the 20 hottest years in the top left-hand corner. And if you remember back to the tweet I showed you beforehand, that's about the 0.4 degree rise in temperature just in the pre-war years that Guy Callender was talking about 81 years ago. This is a new way of visualizing it, which has a lot more visual appeal. It's the same data. Where it's darker blue, it's colder than average. Where it's redder, it's hotter than average throughout this time period. If there was no climate change, of course, the red and the blue would be evenly mixed across there. And clearly, it's not. Yesterday, I had a bit of a stand-up discussion when I was giving another talk about this with somebody who was a former oil executive, and he was saying, well, do we know cause and effect? Do we know cause and effect? And my answer to that was to describe this graph. I didn't show it to him, but describe this graph. This comes from a report published by Exxon, not published, written by Exxon, internally circulated in 1982, and looking ahead at the projected rise in temperature with atmospheric carbon dioxide and temperature on this side. And I've just put those arrows on to show where we are today within rounding error. Exxon, the scientists at Exxon predicted 40 years ago that this is where we would be. Now, if you can predict the effect of your industry on global temperatures 40 years back, I would say from a kind of philosophical perspective, it's difficult to dance on the head of the pin that that's not a causal relationship, because as a statistician, that's the way we kind of do our science. You make a prediction, do the modeling, get a prediction and see whether or not the empirics match it, and clearly they do. So, climate change. Climate change is clearly about the world warming. No issues about that. But as I say, we haven't been good at describing what it really means, and there are three kind of major things about climate change that it's worth being aware of. One is climate change. So climate is the average weather, in effect. So this is a map of the world under 4 degrees rise in temperature. This comes from the UK Met Office. As you can see, so the average annual temperature in the UK is 10 degrees. That's our longest running global record of temperature. The Central England temperature is just a touch over 10 degrees now. If we go towards a 4-degree world, which is where we're heading at the moment, given current emissions and the ambition of reducing emissions, puts us somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees, then we get a world like this. Oceans are cooler than 4 degrees. This is 5 degrees, 6 degrees, 7 degrees. And when you get to the top, high latitudes, then you're up to 8, 9, 10 degrees of change. But if you just take where we are, up here, it's predicting, this global map is predicting for a 4-degree world that will effectively add about 4 degrees to the UK. Now, if you add 4 degrees to the UK, that takes you roughly to the same climatic position as southern France, eastern Spain, and so on. So if you just think about that playing out over the course of this century, that sounds like it's okay, we can manage that, it's a gradual change, we can get there. But then think about the world in which we live. Now, I live in the Yorkshire Dales, and it's a beautiful place, but none of the trees that are typically associated with our vision of the UK landscape will still be around in a 4-degree world. If you think about the vegetation, the ecology of southern France, very different. So when you think about that 4-degree change in temperature, it's not just that we can wear our shorts more often, it actually does mean quite deep-seated change. The second thing about climate change is that, as the climate changes, the weather changes. And as the weather changes, the one thing that we're all starting to notice is that we're seeing things that we haven't seen before. Now, Al Gore says, he's got this little catchphrase, New York has seen 3 1-in-100-year events in the last decade. We are seeing not just things that are very rare, like Venice's floods today, 1-in-50-year event, so far in the historical record. We're not seeing things that are just very rare. We're starting to see things that we haven't seen before. And this is just a number of climate extremes in the US. This is US data, and you can see it's just going up through the roof. I'll come back to this in a second. And then the third thing about climate change is not just the changing weather patterns, whether it is Hurricane Dorian or whether it is floods or whether it is wildfires or whatever it is that's associated with weather, is that there is a possibility, call it probability, of large-scale changes in the climate when something happens to reconfigure the climate system. And one example of that, I won't dwell on, but just so that you can think about it, is that the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, AMOC, as it's known in the trade, the Gulf Stream, it takes 5, 6, 7 degrees of heat from the tropics and brings them up to us, and that gives us a nice maritime climate. The Gulf Stream is slowing. There's quite a lot of empirical evidence that it's slowing, and if you run climate models into the future, there's a significant chance that it stops. Now, if it stops, if you just look at a map and go across the same latitude as where we are and try and find a settlement on the other side of the pond, you don't find them because it's almost impossible to live. And again, coming back to food, were the overturning circulation to slow down and switch off, it would have significant effects on our global ability to grow food, and not just in the UK, not just in Europe, but globally, because it reconfigures the way that the climate works. So 3 elements of climate change: the gradual change in climate, the rise in extreme weather, and then the potential for reconfiguration as we pass tipping points, such as the overturning circulation. And as everybody knows, I mean, this is an old slide from 2015, but wherever you look, every day there are climate extremes being recorded. And one of the things just to think about from a London perspective, you know, we're about 1 degree of climate change now, of global warming now. When it was hot in the summer, it was about 10 degrees hotter than normal. So if you think about if that were a linear thing in 2-degree world, 3-degree world, etc., it will start getting really uncomfortable, not just very uncomfortable. And if you think about London, we're built on clay, so if it's getting wetter in the winter and hotter in the summer, that implies there'll be more expansion, contraction of the clay, and buildings will start falling down. So it's not just rising sea level and the Thames barrier, it's not just that we can't use the tube because it's too hot, or we can't sit in offices, or people die because it gets too hot. There are all these existential things to do with the risks associated with that. And just as a brief aside on that, this is data from a database. This is recent data from a database looking at the costs of extreme weather and its various formats, and I've just plotted them on a cloud. But if you notice the vertical axis, economic damage, USD, in a log scale, if you just put a line through that, you get the slope that tells you that the costs of extremes are rising 7 times per decade. And Laura and I were just chatting upstairs. if you take through the fact that if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases today, there's 40 years of climate change linked in because it takes that long for the climate to stabilise. We've got 40 years of climate change. We're not going to stop emitting now, so we've got, say, 20, 30 years of climate change. So let's say, for sake of argument, we've got 70 years of climate change ahead of us before we deal with it. If the costs are changing at 7 times per decade, then that gets you easily to greater than the global economy if you just take a linear extrapolation by the time we've dealt with climate change in terms of the costs of extreme weather. Now, we're not going to get there, but that gives you some sort of sense of the order of magnitude of the issues. Right, so that's the primary climate change. Let's skip on food, land, and climate. The first thing I want to talk about here is the land is finite. We only have the amount of land that we have, and that's about 10.5 billion hectares of ice-free habitable land. Of course, that will expand as the ice melts and so on. But it's actually not very much. Good grief, doesn't time fly when you're having fun? When you start looking at the demands on land in the future, you get very rapidly to the point where actually, if you think about bioenergy, if you think about biomass, if you think about bioplastic, if you think about biopharma, if you think about food, if you think about urban expansion, that land becomes very, very competed for. Where is space for nature? Right, food. So climate change is affecting food. We know climate change is affecting food. This is a recent map of wheat yields. Where it is red, they're declining because of climate change already. Where it is green, they're going up. We know that climate change is affecting agriculture throughout the world because of extreme weather and so on. It's changing nutrient contents. It's affecting infrastructure because of the changing extreme weather, etc. We are moving very quickly into a world of climate disruption. And it's not just the long, slow change in climate that matters. It is also the fact that as weather changes, our systems cannot cope because of shocks. So this is just a cartoon. If you think we are putting a lot of pressure on our global system because we're trying to extract more and more food from less and less land, this is a map showing where there is spare land in the world where it's green, spare land in inverted commas. Our system is getting really, really, really pressured. And then at the same time, our system is getting interconnected, so it depends on oil, it depends on cyber, it depends on finance, food system depends on oil, land, finance, etc., water. And then at the same time, the weather is changing, and we're hitting this increasingly fragile interconnected system with a big hammer. And then when you start doing that, weather effects, bang, people start panicking, markets start panicking, governments start panicking, and then you get the potential for very large feedbacks through markets and policy decisions, which then drive food price spikes. Food price spikes then drive food riots. In the last food price spikes, 2007, 8, 10, 11, 47 countries had food riots. You can follow the food riots of the Arab Spring and drought in Syria through to destabilization of people movement, people change, breakdown, migration in Europe, and Brexit. Okay, so that's climate is affecting food. Food is clearly affecting climate. I won't dwell on the details of this, but this is the bottom line. About 1/3 of global greenhouse gases come from the food system. When you take into account rainforests being chopped down, agriculture, transport, processing, packaging, and so on. And of that 1/3, which is greater than transport, it's greater than heating, cooling, it's greater than lighting, etc., etc. Of that 1/3, about 50% comes from livestock. I won't dwell on it because Laura's starting to scowl at me, but two big messages from the IPCC land report. The first is that by changing our diets, we have a very big chance of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. This is just a figure from the IPCC report that shows the potential greenhouse gas mitigation from dietary change. The total greenhouse gas mitigation from all changes in agriculture is is about 7.8. It's about the same order of magnitude as going to a vegan diet. And the total changes possible from changing livestock agriculture is about 2.4 gigatons. Now, dietary change might be a good idea from a nutritional perspective anyway. This is a map of this is a figure of what the world should grow to make people healthy in their diets. And this is a map of what the world grows. And people are increasingly unhealthy through diets. And you don't have to be a statistician to see that those are significantly different. And to a first approximation, if we ate a healthy diet, it would also be a more sustainable diet than the diet that we eat. And then we would get healthcare changes for free. Final points to make. I'll just stop on this one. Two big things from the Paris Climate Agreement, and therefore the IPCC Special Report on Land around greenhouse gases, food and agriculture, is that if we change our diets, we can mitigate emissions by producing less. But also, we might need to change our diets to allow us to be anywhere close to a Paris Climate Agreement. This is the amount of emissions. This green line is the line that we would have to follow if we are to meet the Paris climate greenhouse gas budget. Now, we're not going to do that. We're likely to follow something like this red line. So in this period up to mid-century, where we're supposed to be zero net carbon, we would be over-emitting greenhouse gases, and therefore we'd go beyond the Paris less than 2 degrees aim. And if we're to meet Paris, then we'd have to take carbon out of the atmosphere in the latter half of the century. Now, that taking carbon out of the atmosphere, according to this graph, would use 8 million square kilometers of land for sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. That's 2.5 Indias, the size of 2.5 Indias, or about 60% of the land that we currently use for agriculture. So if we are going to deal with Paris and get anywhere close to Paris, it implies that we have to change our diets to mitigate the emissions. And also, by changing our diets, we potentially free up land that could then be used for climate mitigation. Okay, and then, sorry, I'll skip that. That, of course, then leads us to the issue of zero net carbon land use, which is a government commitment now for middle of the century. There are two visions for zero net carbon land use. One is that we intensively grow biomass alongside intensive production of land, production of food. And the other vision, so this is kind of industrialized farming vision, the other vision, which is a kind of Prince Charles-like vision, is that we demand less from land, we don't waste so much food, we grow a diversity of stuff, the right sort of thing, we make space to be able to grow in a softer way, and we integrate the carbon capture from biomass in agroforestry within the land use. Right. Final slide. How do we get towards a food system and a land use system that is zero net carbon? It's not just a matter of putting on a carbon price on everything. This is a table from the IPCC report. There's a whole lot of different things that we can do. Changing food environments, we can educate, we can change incentives, we can change subsidies, we can put incentives in place for reducing waste, increase circularity, do agricultural R&D. We can do a whole lot of different things. Lots of things. It's not just food prices are going to rise because we're going to tax the hell out of meat. Okay, so I will leave this up here. I will not speak to this because I am dreadfully over time. Sorry, Laura. Thank you very much, everybody.
I always think that when I hear you give that talk, which I've heard you give in different iterations, that it will be less terrifying because I've heard it before, but it's really not. I think I can expect that we'll have lots of questions from the audience, but I did just want to start with one, and particularly because you didn't get to give much time to it there. But thinking about interventions and some of the conditions that would be either enabling or disabling for a positive transformation of the food system and the land system more broadly. Which among those do you think has the most transformative potential? And what's your belief on how feasible it is for that transformation to happen at the pace and the scale that we need?
So those are 3 questions. So the IPCC report, that blue slide with lots of boxes on that I skipped over, says that there are a lot of things that have potential to help us mitigate and adapt and not make things worse. The one that we have the highest confidence in being able to do is actually change diets, because we know that that can reduce land pressure. We know that there are societal benefits largely from doing that. Then you ask the question, well, is that feasible? Yes, that's feasible, because when you look at the young today, particularly, there is a whole lot of climate carnivory or veganism or flexitarianism and awareness of changing diets. And when you look at what the healthcare service, the NHS, is saying about needing to go to a preventative healthcare system, there is starting to be some kind of congruence at government level about needing to be preventative and eat healthy diets. So you can see things coming together in a kind of helpful way. But then the issue is, well, is that going to happen fast enough? Because that green curve on that line, on that graph that I showed towards the end, if we overshoot that zero net carbon bit in the middle of the century, then the consequences are twofold: that we need a lot of land for the biomass to suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and the other consequence is that we lock in a bit more climate change into the future, and then the risk of passing one of these tipping points gets greater. So from my perspective, the urgency of change is not that we have to start going down from our exponentially increasing emissions now. We have to actually start going down, and not just reduce the rate at which emissions are going up, have to start going down, and that is something that we have to do over the next decade. Now, we can do that, but whether there is the societal will, the gilets jaunes kind of societal pushback against trying to reduce our energy consumption and change our diets, etc., whether we can actually do that, I don't know. So we can, but we might not.
Do you think that's necessary, that social tipping point, as it were? Do you think we need that mobilisation from the public in order to get where we need to be?
Yes. So I've been working in this space for 15, 20 years, something like that. And we're in a radically different place this year. And at our climate change conference a month or so ago, all of the highlight ministerial speakers were saying we're in a different place because of Greta Thunberg and school climate strikes and Extinction Rebellion. The issues are starting to become politicised, and not politicised in a party politicised way, but politicised in the sense that people are starting to care about it enough that it becomes a political thing to respond to. And only when that happens will we start getting significant change. Now, whether we get significant enough change at the pace that we need it to without something helping us along and hurting us, you know, whether it's a small number of floods or something where people get scared and say we must start acting, or whether it is something like Hurricane Dorian stalling over Miami instead of stalling over the Bahamas and then multi-trillion damage that will wake people up and say we've got to change. I don't know. And I hope if we do end up in a situation where climate impacts create enough pain for us to start acting, then I hope it's not too much pain, because, you know, there is a risk that millions of people will be affected in a negative way over the next decade or so.
Gloomy.
But the world will be a better place if we change. You know, there is a lot to play for. You know, existential anxiety amongst the young. You know, I do quite a lot of school talks. Lots of people in my daughter's school are seeking counselling, and one of the reasons for seeking counselling is that they don't feel that they've got a positive world to grow up into. And then 38% of our tax spend is being spent on dealing with the illnesses often associated with poor diets. You know, there are so many things that we would be better off if we had a different relationship with food and climate. But, you know, so there is, it's not, we're going to be worse off by dealing with climate change. It is we're going to be better off by dealing with climate change. The pathway might be a bit tricky, but there is a lot to play for.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to questions. Just a few requests. Could you firstly wait for the microphone before speaking? That's because we're live streaming and it won't pick you up otherwise. Could you keep your hand raised so that we can find you, so that my colleagues with mics can find you? And please, could you just give a very brief introduction? Just say your name and who you're affiliated with if you wish, but keep it brief. Thank you. So I'm going to start at this side of the room and work over. So concentrate yourselves that way. Yeah, go for it.
Hi, I'm Zach Polanski. I'm the Green Party parliamentary candidate for this area. Whenever I do interviews, there's always a discrepancy between the idea that the government isn't doing enough compared to their status in Europe. I understand some of it is because we're no longer counting aviation and shipping, and something about embedded carbon, the amount of tons that we're including in that data. Could you speak to some of that discrepancy and how we could more accurately record that data?
So some of the issues to do with the inventory is that the inventory is done according to the country that is doing the emissions, even if that emissions is for another country. So particularly in food, you know, we can say our agriculture is producing less year on year, which we are, producing less greenhouse gases year on year. But some of that going down is because we're no longer feeding cows on grass as much as we used to. We're now feeding cows on soya and concentrate food that comes with a greenhouse footprint from outside. So that discrepancy is often to do with the way that we account. And on a global basis, it's not the individual country accounts that matter, it is the totality. So there is quite a movement towards thinking about running two sets of accounts. One is your production accounts and one is your consumption accounts. And particularly as we think about moving towards a zero net carbon land use in the middle of the century, the worst possible thing to do would be if we are offshore most of our carbon emissions to make our land zero net carbon, so we can then trumpet that we're world leaders. So it does need thinking about, it does need dealing with. Yeah, trade is an interesting issue.
Next round of questions, yeah. This gentleman here. Anyone else, so that you can get a mic for the next question? Yeah, lady over there. Yeah, it's this one.
Purely rotationally. Thank you, Laura. Dominic Carity from Rabobank. Very good presentation. Easy question, can you share it afterwards? And then back to the more structural question. So as an agricultural bank, we look a lot at this type of issue. And internally, the 2050, feed 9 billion people, you know, whatever. And the question I've asked people like Viva Dreyer is, what about overpopulation as a component in the overall equation?
Yeah, so obviously, you know, I'm a professor of ecology, so by nature I'm a Malthusian. So you can't have an infinite population on a finite planet, and you know that much is logically straightforward. But it's not population per se, it is consumption growth that is the problem. And one American, if I remember footprinting right, is worth 17 Somalis. So it is really about how do we deal with consumption growth as opposed to how do we deal with population growth. And you know, we grow enough calories at the moment to feed 11 billion people. We just choose to feed a third of them to livestock and throw about a third of them away. We can make our food system different, we can make it more efficient. Yeah, and I think we forget, because it's so deeply embedded, that consumerism was a deliberative post-war ideology to drive economies. And you can easily imagine economies not built on consumerism, but being built on, for example, growth in well-being as opposed to growth in material consumption. So we could get a situation where the population growth wasn't really a problem. And the traditional argument has been that as people have got wealthier, then fertility rates go down anyway. So it becomes a kind of self-correcting issue. Now, whether that's actually true, I think the data is suggesting it's not as true as we thought it would be, because we're still so culturally embedded in the way that we think of things. But yeah, it's the consumption growth. That's the problem. Yeah.
Yep, one over here, and then this gentleman. But yes, yeah, go for it.
Thank you. I'm Julia Needham-Watts. I'm a councillor from Richmond upon Thames, where I sit on the Environment Committee. We are just introducing our climate emergency strategy. And I just wanted to ask you about what sometimes seems to me almost a knee-jerk reaction that people should cut out meat from their diet. I say that as someone who doesn't eat meat. And I worry that then there will be a reaction to get vegetable sources from a great distance, and that transportation is also a challenge. And I had a second thought that you said you live in the beautiful Yorkshire Dales, and if we change from eating the meat from the farming that has shaped those dales, won't that also have an impact there? And how do you see that taking shape?
So very few people who kind of sit in my niche argue that the world should be vegan or vegetarian. The issue is that if we want to live within planetary boundaries, we can't all eat as much meat as we would, the market tells us we want to, or we demand, depending on how you phrase it. And as an ecologist, I would say, for the reasons that you talk about the shaping of the landscapes, almost all of our natural ecosystems would have a large grazer that was responsible for doing stuff. The issue, though, is that if you want purely grass-fed livestock, then meat consumption would have to go down to about 30% of where we are. And there is an argument to say, actually, having grass-fed ruminants grazing out on the hills and on the plains is a rational use of that land, and what we shouldn't be doing is growing corn and feeding it to pigs or feeding it to poultry. So although if you look at it first principles, if you're going to eat white meat, it has a lower emissions profile, the total system might be worse off if everybody stopped eating red meat and only ate white meat. And so there isn't a right answer to this. The only boundary condition is that as a globe, we're aiming towards eating too much meat. And in some places, ruminant livestock makes a lot of sense. In other places, there are other ways of doing it. And you're exactly right, that pie chart I put up, the world doesn't grow enough fruit and vegetables, and if everybody suddenly went to the 5 a day, where would we get it from? It wouldn't necessarily be easy. That's a journey in itself. And the reason that we've invested in grains as major commodity crops is that fruit and vegetables are difficult to transport, and they require cold chains or food processing or whatever. So it's, you know, on the wall of my chemistry lab at school was a sign, which I think is pertinent here. There's no such thing as a dangerous substance. There are only dangerous ways of using substances. And the same for the food system. There is no wrong food. There is only a wrong way of using food or producing food. So all things in moderation, as my mother would have said all through my early years, all through things in moderation. But this notion that the world can have whatever it demands is just patently failing. And so somehow we've got to get our head around doing things differently. And from a farming, I work with quite a few farmer groups around the country. The issue that we face is how do you grow less and make more money? And that is the business challenge of making this transformation a just transformation for the people who work within the food chain. And it's perfectly possible to imagine for livestock. I mean, one of my friends has switched from intensive to extensive, slow-grown stuff and gets far more money now from having half the number of sheep on his fields. And, you know, so it is possible, but it requires people to be willing to pay and not just want cheaper and cheaper and cheaper food.
I'll take a question here, but give me a little wave from this area if you want to ask a question next.
That man behind has had his hand up, and Rosie's got a hand up.
2 questions here then.
Walt.
Walt Patterson, Chatham House, a fellow in Tim's department here at Chatham House. I was struck by your graph of the good nutrition and the actual nutrition. And one of the biggest changes is that in the actual nutrition, 16% is sugar. I was dumbfounded by that. On next Monday, I'm going to be going to a meeting of the local University of the Third Age with a presentation on sugar, suggesting that it should be considered a poison. Would you like to comment on that possibility?
Well, certainly. I mean, one of my colleagues talks about fizzy drinks, sugar-sweetened beverage manufacturers having a business model of selling obesity. And if you look at the total calories sold by a single fizzy drink company in the United States, it's more than the total calories that would be required for healthy diets on a daily basis in the United States. So you have an issue there that sugar, when you overconsume it, is just as potently toxic in many ways as tobacco or other things like that. And it's not just how much sugar is grown. The other example I would float past you is that we have gone through years and years and years of agricultural selection to sweeten the fruits that we eat. And I remember as a child being weaned onto adult food, and my parents used to have a grapefruit on a Saturday morning when we had a big sit-down breakfast. You know, this was late 60s or whatever, and I was forced to eat that grapefruit, and I was so sharp. And now you can drink grapefruit juice by the gallon, and the reason you can do that is because the sugar content is about double what it used to be. So it's not only that we grow sugar and eat sugar and everything, it is all of the things that we breed have got higher sugar content or higher starch content, same sort of thing. And that's partly why we've got such an obesogenic diet.
A question here.
Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Andrews, in this context, I'm councillor with Cotswold District Council, chair of the Scrutiny Committee, and the council declared a climate change emergency in July of this year. Since then, I've been looking at how I go about scrutinising our council in order to see that they are doing the right sort of things. Immediate thing seems to be that picking on one particular area doesn't actually help. There needs to be an holistic, system-based approach to the whole of addressing climate change, certainly at the practical local government level where we're a planning authority, because there are so many things to do with tourism, attracting people into the places like the Cotswolds. If we move over to EVs, where do they get all charged up? Indeed, could the grid locally stand plugging in 50 cars on a Sunday afternoon because they've all run out of juice? Answer probably no, it would collapse. There's all sorts of things of that sort. The fact that people are concentrating on those issues like EVs and so on, and the generation of electricity, rather than the rural countryside issues which we face as well, and environmental and biodiversity issues. What I don't see, though, is people being encouraged to take that holistic approach. Everybody's going for a climate strategy change that addresses the things that they know about, the Rumsfeld known knowns.
That's a very good point, and I have spent the last 20 years arguing that we need to take systemic approaches to this. And actually, if you think about only dealing with climate change, then typically that would drive you in a direction that makes biodiversity worse, makes soil worse, makes air quality worse, etc., etc. So we have to kind of try and think about the totality. But then, of course, that becomes more complicated because it creates a certain degree of policy paralysis that anybody who moves in this direction within a policy domain is likely to upset somebody else over there. So they all have to work together. And if there's one thing about government is that it's more siloed than academia, and getting that kind of cross thinking is really difficult. But it's going to be forced upon us if we don't change. And you know, the reason I'm interested in social tipping points, as Laura pointed out, is that we need to have this politicization of people wanting to address the issue and seeing that food is related to climate, food is related to health, air quality is related to food, biodiversity is related to food. All of these things are related, and there are a similar set of common causes which are to do with the way that we live our lifestyle. And if we want to deal with all of these things simultaneously, it comes down to how do we enable a lifestyle choice that becomes positive. And of course, that's really difficult. But as I said earlier, unless we do it, it will be forced upon us anyway. And I think there are sufficient examples. And one of the joys I see it of interacting with governments at multiple levels is that the smaller the government, the more those issues become easier to deal with because you can get all of the people in the room, you can get all of the voters together and have a conversation with them instead of mail shotting 20 million people at a time. And so, you know, whether it's London Food Board and Rosie's work at the back, or whether it is Milan cities, or whether it is local councils trying to do the right thing. You know, my local town, Ilkley, is doing exactly what you're doing, and we're trying to find ways of navigating all of these sorts of things. But it's part of the issue is recognising that everything's interrelated. So from a UK perspective, and I'll shut up in a minute, from a UK perspective, our agricultural economy pays £10 billion into the economy. It takes £2.5 billion of subsidies. It creates about £2.5 billion of carbon costs. It creates about £5 billion of air, water, soil pollution from fertiliser. And our ill health coming from poor diets is about 30 to 50 billion, depending on what you look at. And then, so when you add it all together, you have 10 billion of positives and then 60 billion of negatives. And of course, when you look at it from that perspective, it makes no sense to carry on driving the intensification of agriculture if it comes with all of these things. So the first thing is, let's try and join up and have a governance structure that recognises that things are interconnected. And lots of people are waving. Hello, everybody.
I'm going to give this side a chance, gentleman at the back there, just behind you, and then back over to Sue, and I think Rosie had a question as well.
I did put my Twitter feed and email up. If anybody following this, if you don't have time to engage me with conversation, please drop me a line.
My name is Paul Robson, a member of Chatham House. What is the potential of the agricultural sector in itself to tackle these issues, for example, reducing nitrates, generating biogas from cattle waste, etc. And is there any interest in the industry itself, the sector itself, tackling these issues without us going into the larger issue of diet?
The mitigation potential from change within farming without changing the demand side is about the same as the change in the demand side. And together, they're enough. One alone is not going to be enough. And so, you know, clearly there are many things that a farmer can do. You know, reducing nitrogen and making nitrogen use more efficient is a winner from a bottom line perspective as well as an environmental perspective. There are lots of things like that. I think the issue is that if we try and tackle part of the problem, let's call it emissions, then the other parts of the problem, the biodiversity loss, the ill health that comes from growing the wrong thing and producing too much sugar, doesn't get tackled. So it makes more sense from a societal perspective to be systemic about it. And I sometimes use the example, you know, you can imagine making a supply chain sustainable by farming in an environmentally sensitive way. But if you're growing tobacco, that doesn't make a lot of sense from the total societal cost perspective, even if it's sustainably produced. So it's how do we deal with all of the issues? And given that changing diets is necessary, if we're not going to bankrupt the health service, changing diets will give us the climate change for free, if you want to look at it like that, if we get it right.
So I've got two questions at the back, and then a gentleman here waving as well.
Super Richard, Director of the RSA's Food Farming and Countryside Commission, and Tim is also one of our members of our research advisory group. So it's lovely to hear all over again all of the things that we have drawn on so heavily to produce our report. We are now focused on what to do. Having produced our recommendations, how do we implement those recommendations? And I think you've touched already on the challenge embedded in that. When people talk about broken systems, I think what they actually mean is that we're not looking at the beneficiaries of the current system. Systems are very rarely broken. We're just not noticing who the real beneficiaries are. And I'm really pleased to see that you're pointing to some of the economic underpinning practices that hold us in our current state. So that the big question, therefore, is what do we do to shift the conversation away from what is currently almost a reductive polarization, vegan or animal or this, that, or that land use, to focusing our attention on the underpinning economic drivers that are holding us where we are?
Yeah, good question. So we have spent 70 years, effectively post-Bretton Woods, post-Second World War, designing a system predicated on the notion that the cheaper we make food, the more available we make food, the more we create a public good. And of course, that has been designed deliberatively, policy, R&D, trade policy, research policy, development of kit for farmers, etc., markets, etc., etc. So it's a huge monolith, and it's not that a livestock farmer is a bad boy. A livestock farmer is making a livelihood trapped in a system which is difficult to get out of. So how do you reconfigure the system, given the entrenched power, given the sunk capital, etc., whilst also trying to make it better? And you know, Richard Dawkins, who was one of my tutors when I was an undergraduate, used to talk about evolution. You know, can you imagine if you're trying to change a plane, evolution would work by changing a propeller-driven plane into a jet plane, changing one bolt at a time. And it has to be better each step of the way for evolution to allow that to happen. And of course, we can't do that. We can't necessarily evolve our system easily. So I think part of the issue from my perspective is it looks so difficult that we should be, and Tim Lang often talks about this, the time for policy change is when there is a disruption to the system. And without getting too political, one of the sad things about Brexit is that we're disrupting the system and we're not looking to design it in a way that links trade policy to health policy, to environmental policy, to farming policy. There is some kind of talk about that, and the new National Food Strategy is trying to put the pieces together, but part of the National Food Strategy to start off with was excluding trade. And you can't think about the food we eat in the UK without including trade. So we need to take advantage of these situations, and it might be that we come to our senses and think deliberatively about how we can make our food system better rather than just make food cheaper. Or it might be that something else happens in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. We have another food price spike, or we have something else that causes us to reconsider. But it's not going to be easy. It's clearly not going to be easy. But the first point is for us to recognize that all of these things are interrelated. Yeah.
So I'll take a question from Rosie, and then the gentleman here, and then
this is
over to you after.
Rosie Boycott. I sit on Feeding Britain and the Food Foundation and various other things. It's really ongoing from Sue's question, and that, I mean, I don't think that you put those slides up at the beginning and saying these are all connected to climate change. That actually should be on the front page of our newspapers, and it isn't. They're still seen as isolationists. So given that we have against a real cultural problem around things like cheap food, do you think ultimately we have to legislate that? Can we do this culturally, or is it going to be is it going to require tough, proper action?
I think the time will come when people will accept the legislation, but I don't think the time is now, as with the Gilets jaunes. And you know, everywhere you look around the world, there is increasing levels of social disruption, and you know, part of that is because people feel left behind by globalization. Part of that is for a whole range of different reasons, but then the potential retrograde step of making familiar and liked foods more expensive, or making petrol more expensive, would be a really difficult thing politically. But I mean, one of the reasons I work at Chatham House now is because there is a debate to be had in the wider community that I don't think the academic community is doing enough in, about making these, as I said earlier, politicized in the sense of joining the dots, getting people talking about it, getting people caring about it, because government won't act until people say they want to act, and if government acts, then industry will follow. And I was at a working group the other day where all of the industry representatives were saying, we would love it, government, if you would legislate, because that removes our paralysis about first mover disadvantage and all the rest of that. So you tell us that we have to do things in a different way and we'll accept it. But it's until we as a citizens say, we're only going to elect politicians if this is your top 3 priorities or whatever.
Can we take this gentleman here and that gentleman there at the same time?
At the same time.
Anthony Newton, what do you say to people in Extinction Rebellion? Are there aspects with which you agree?
Yeah, so they are, whether you like their tactics or not, and actually I quite enjoyed it when they were camping out here because I'd wander around having conversations and, you know, find myself talking to 70-something doctors who are out on the streets living under canvas because they're worried about their grandchildren and so on. So it's not just about the politicization and anarchy of youth. Some of their tactics obviously are counterproductive, but the fact that they are getting people to worry about this issue is a positive thing. And as our 3 or 4 ministers at the climate change conference said, you know, we are in a different place because this is now part of our conversation, whereas 5 years ago it wasn't.
Sahil Shah. You mentioned earlier increasing incidences of extreme weather and building upon the work which you did around with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Molly John's work around multiple breadbasket failure. You talked about how we need to shift the food system, but when you've got increasing risks, not just climate related, but also conflict related, where major food system shocks, how are you ensuring you have not just a more efficient global food production system, but a significantly more resilient one for the new types of shocks that we face in the 21st century? What do you think both the mitigation measures are and the adaptation ones?
Well, I increasingly don't think about mitigation and adaptation because they're often the same thing. So if, for example, you eat a healthier diet and it's more diversified, you're both adapting and mitigating at the same time. So it's a really important point, and I think, you know, were we ever to leave Brexit in a hard way, an unplanned way, it would be a test of the resilience of our food system. 4 years ago, we did the climate change risk assessment, the UK climate change risk assessment, and one of the recommendations in that was the UK should think about building a more resilient food system. And government's response to that at the time was, we don't need to because the market will take it into account. And recently somebody from DEFRA came up to me and said, actually, we realised that you're right, because it's only by going through the process of Yellowhammer that we realise how fragile our food system is, and we do have to think about the resilience of our food system. Now, there are many ways of thinking about building resilience. Diversity is one, because it has many benefits. We could have a more diverse countryside, we could have more diverse diets, we could be more healthy, etc. Thinking about how to store food is expensive, but there are ways of thinking about that in public sense. There are ways of thinking about virtual stores of food. Ways of thinking about resilience of the transport infrastructure. So as an example, one of the issues with maize coming out of the Midwest is not that you have a Midwest drought, but that the Mississippi dries up and then you can't get the grain boats down the Mississippi. And then the only way that you can get the grain out is by rail, but the rail is actually taking all of the shale oil sands out of that part of the neck of the woods. So it's not just about the production of food, it's about making all of our systems resilient and all the rest of that, whilst minimizing some of the long distance transports, because we don't want to make our food system resilient by flying in lots of food from Chile or wherever it might be. So yeah, but part of the issue is that our food system, however you define it in terms of efficiency, is really inefficient. Agriculture is really efficient. So if you're thinking just about calorie conversion into healthy diets, it's probably under 2% of what is grown turns into a healthy diet, because so much gets thrown away, so much of it is overeaten, so much of it is fed to livestock and the trophic losses, etc. So we could make our food system more resilient by reducing waste, by changing our eating patterns. And it's not just the technology of the food stores, changing our desire to have exactly the same thing on the shelves in supermarkets day in, day out, whatever season, etc. If we were a bit more flexible, and it's interesting because the retailers say, well, we're only doing what you demand. And for many of us as consumers and citizens, you're not kind of aware, it's not a deliberative thing. We're kind of conditioned into it. We could behave in a different way when it comes to thinking about what we want to choose from supermarkets. We don't need strawberries on Christmas Day. So part of it is the behavioural response, but part of it is also the technological and market response.
Thank you. It's 2 o'clock, so unless anyone has a really, really burning question, no, I'll bring it to a close. Please join me in thanking Tim for his...
Thank you, everybody.